keeps prices down far more effectively. Comrade Karanja, His Excellency says you are unbalanced.
I'm a man in search of man. I was never in search of God.
In conversation tonight, my guest is Pradip Khandwalla. He's the director of the Indian Institute of Management and regarded by most people as the guru of management studies in India. You know, when we talk about management in India, is there a unique sort of style of Indian management? You know, we're familiar with the Japanese style and maybe an American style. Is there an Indian style or approach to management that's unique?
I don't think there's a Japanese style, nor an American style. I think these are overblown generalizations. Nor do I think there's an Indian style. I mean, it's a multicultural, differentiated society and bound to have multiple modes of management. And if you look at the Birlas and Tatas and Reliance and so on, you'll see that there are very different modes of management, although some people have talked of the Indian style of management, mostly in negative terms. But in fact, my own research shows that there are many different styles of management in this country.
I speak as a layperson, and that, you know, when we talk about the Japanese style of management, it's a Japanese firm, like an extended family, and surely there's a different management ethic or a managing style that is now coming into India. And what might be an appropriate style of management in that sense?
I think what's coming into the country is not so much style as some tools of management, some approaches like quality circles and things like that. Earlier we got from them long-range planning from the states, budgeting and so on. And now you're getting some of the tools that the Japanese adapted from the American practice. But I expect that there will be a diversity of managements in the country in terms of the way they approach problems. What you see today, for example, is an enormous burst of entrepreneurship. I mean, when you and I were growing up, 100 crores was a very large project. And even after allowing for inflation, you have projects every day. You read of 1,000 crores, 2,000 crores, 5,000 crores, 10,000 crore projects. There is therefore this explosion, and it's not as if these are all kind of prototypes. These are homegrown entrepreneurs, not necessarily from IIMs, and they have their own individuality, their own unique way of functioning. In Ahmedabad alone, you have the Torrent Group, which is not managed differently from the way Mr. Patel manages Nirma, and not the same way as the way Sunil Handa and his brother manage the core group. So you have a lot of variety here. Right? I don't believe that you're going to have a tendency towards any kind of unique Indian mode of management. It was always a fiction, and it's not tenable at all now.
When you train students at the Indian Institute of Management, do you train them to position themselves in these different styles of management, approaches to management?
What we do is we give them a core curriculum during the first year, which is uniform for all the students. So they get what we define today as the basics of management. This may not be the same as what we may think of management 10 years from now, but as of now, this is the American definition of core of management, and we have been teaching that. In the second year, there's a very large range of electives, about 60 odd electives plus 60 odd project courses. And so students can learn, therefore, to position themselves the way they would like to. Some, for example, would like to position themselves to become entrepreneurs, and they take those kinds of courses. Some would like to get into multinational, and they take the kinds of courses that the multinationals would look for. Some might want to go into consultancy, and they might want to take those courses which help them become consultants, and so on. Some of them, a few every year, would like to get into the Indian administrative services. Some go into NGOs also, and they obviously would like to take those courses which position them for those kinds of careers.
You know, sort of management education is relatively new, and you had people who sort of intuited what was the right thing to do. So how important do you consider management studies to be?
I it depends upon what you mean by management. To me, management is a principle of life. Anything that is living and anything that has any goals has to manage. So even a bacterium has to manage how to get its food and so on. So if you look at it that way, not only as business management of the MBA type that we have got from the States, then management has an enormous future. And in fact, if you look at the Indian scene today, it's not only corporate management that is booming. You've got institutions of management in the administrative sector, in education, in practically police, for example, army. Every sector in this country is having some kind of institution for disseminating management, which is tailor-made to that sector. It of course draws upon the larger body of professional management literature, but it also has its own sort of contextual materials that it does teach.
Actually, I have to confess, it was a learning experience for me looking at some of your books. Traditionally, we do look at management as something that applies to the corporate sector. And you have done considerable work in looking at organizational business systems and strategies for development, so to speak. What kind of applications and where do you think management studies would have in helping a poor person in a backward village in Bihar, say?
Good question. I'm not sure that management studies per se are going to be very helpful, but management as a discipline instills in you a capacity for asking some right questions. No matter what you are, whether you're an NGO or starting some kind of a activity in a Bihar village, but you need to ask some basic questions. And the advantage of going through a management education is that you ask these questions at the start rather than learn to ask these questions over a period of 5 years. It cuts down the learning time. You cannot transplant what you learn in classroom automatically to field situations, because each field situation is unique. But what you do learn to do is to ask the right questions. Where are we going to get the finances from? How are we going to make our services more acceptable to whatever we define as our clients? And they may not be consumers at all. They may be clients, may be poor people who you're trying to provide some service to them. So asking those, what is our long-term strategy of making an impact? It doesn't mean that you replicate corporate strategy, but you ask this question: how do we position ourselves? What do we emphasize? What is the niche we would like to work in? How do we develop human resources? Now, these are questions that you ask, and of course you draw to some extent upon your MBA kind of background, but only to a limited extent. Again and again we find that when the students come back after several years, they tell us that the most important thing they learned was not the tools and techniques of management, but the questions that a manager must ask and what he must do. And that is I think the essence of management education.
You know, like the study of economics is partly empirical and partly in the area of the unpredictable. How do you predict consumer response to a given incentive impetus? How does management seek to resolve that? Are you sort of closer to honing in to a predictable response from employees when you're doing sort of human resource development?
I'm not sure that is the right way to approach creative management. I think the way to approach creative management is to make certain things salient, let us say, to make certain things obvious. Okay, we have to do this. This is our mission, this is our goal. And then let people evolve creative responses. Now, if you try to program them, and which is very often done, you get a certain amount of efficiency, but you don't get innovation. If you want innovative responses, you have to give the people freedom. Yes, you've got the big picture has to be presented to them. They have to accept that big picture. But then the way you go about doing it, the arrangements you make, the improvisations you make, increasingly as I've been now an educator for 25, 26 years, and the more I feel that the essence of management is improvisation. It is not systems, it is improvisation of systems, it is modification of systems to meet particular situations. So the whole approach of trying to use management as if it's a technology, so that there is one right way of doing it, is an absurd way of approaching management. That is why we use a case method at IIMA, where students are encouraged to come up with diverse viewpoints, diverse approaches to solving a problem, as compared to some other places where you're told to, in a sense, apply textbook solutions to a problem and make little adjustment here and there. Well, the whole approach to management, in my view, is it has to be a creative response. You have to improvise.
You mentioned improvisation, you mentioned creativity, and an area of interest of yours is creativity.
Yes.
And I remember reading sort of recently in a book of yours when you were interacting with your child and said, what is the opposite of cupboard?
Yes.
And that sounded like a Zen koan to me, trying to sort of get a handle on that. How creative, how does a manager interpret creativity?
I think there is a very great role of creativity. Now, obviously, you're not talking of Shakespeare-like creativity or Newton-like creativity or Einstein-like creativity. You're talking about more humdrum variety kinds of creativity. And the work that I've done in turnaround management, where I've seen a number of case studies of how organizations that were sick were turned around, one has come across this sort of fresh approach. It's not creative in a capital C creative thing, but interesting things have been done, huge communications exercises to mobilize people, sending people, transferring in General Motors, for example, they transferred 6,000-7,000 employees to a newly acquired company to get them that culture of this very dynamic new company. Now, these are kinds of innovative responses. So, for example, in one company, the quality had gone down badly, and the workers were resistant to improving that quality. So they brought in dealers to dramatize how angry customers were feeling about the products, and the dealers made a grand show of it in the factory itself. And the workers felt that their professional sort of pride was at stake, and very dramatically things improved. So there are these examples of creativity which take Jaipur Metals in our country, where one Mr. Kavadi, who was an IAS officer, took over the company. As you know, it was a Kamani company and very sick, and it was nationalized by the Rajasthan government. And here was a man who told the workers, look, I'm going to freeze your wages or cut your wages, you're going to work more in a public sector unit, and I'm not going to pay you money beyond a certain point, I'm going to give you shares of the company, which that time were worthless. And the workers accepted, and today Jaipur Metals, even 10 years after that change, is still doing well. So you have many examples of creativity of this kind, where what you might in hindsight might call common sense, but at that point it was a fresh response in that situation. Somebody else had not thought of it, the person thought of it and did something very interesting. So I would certainly say that, and particularly now, in the kind of society we are going to be living in, if liberalization continues, where you're going to have a lot more innovation, a lot more competition, a lot of new products, new services, I would think that creativity is going to be very, very important.
An area that you work in with creativity, of course, is I hesitate to use the word teaching, but shall we say encouraging people, training people to be more creative. Is something like as abstract as creativity capable of being taught?
Well, the assumption on which you embark on a training program is that there is intrinsic creativity in every human being. A child is creative. How come then we are not creative? What has happened? So part of the course of training is to peel off the inhibitions, the constraints, the blocks that people have over time acquired.
What are these sort of inhibitions and blocks that you...
Fear of failure, for example, is a major block for many people in our country. Ambiguity, intolerance. People don't like confusing situations. While there's a lot of potential for creativity precisely in those situations. As you know, in science, it's the anomaly that really sort of triggers the great insight. So those touchiness, we are not very good at relating very on equal terms with each other and being frank with each other. We are touchy. We shirk from confrontation of issues. So these are some of the blocks that I think people in a traditional society, where there is a lot of socialization and therefore a lot of blocks are internalized. Now you try to peel these things off, not by making you into sort of primitive, I mean that's not the idea, but to reduce some of the fears that censor out creative ideas. So that's one part of the other one is to create in you the motivation and the confidence that you can be creative, that creativity is very natural. Third is to say that yes, there are very specific levels or kinds of intelligence that are involved in creativity. There are certain tricks of the trade, so to speak, which you can use for, like brainstorming, for example, where you do not restrict your ideation. You let your mind go free, And you very quickly find that you are able to come up with so many solutions and things of that kind. So it's really in three parts. One is to drop the forces that inhibit your intrinsic creativity. Second is to give you confidence that you can be creative and create in you the motivation to be creative, because it's so much fun to be creative. And third is to give you some tools and techniques and cues, if you like, to become more creative.
In some of these, like removing the internal inhibitors to change, it almost sounds like a role for a psychiatrist.
Well, we don't go that far, because we don't assume that the person is sick. We assume that he is socialized into certain attitudes and mental blocks. And it's not as if the person is sick, but the society perhaps is sick. And so you try to reduce some of the pressures of if you like, in Freudian terms, the superego, and work with the ego in becoming more confident, and work with more freedom. And that is precisely what you try to do, to create space for yourself within yourself. You know, we talk of creating space in a social system, but what about the space inside? And that is what you try to create, and then the intrinsic creativity begins to come out.
You know, there is concern that with economic liberalization and the opening up of the economy and the styles of management that get associated with it, that they are somehow, in some manner, not as respecting of individuality, of human frailty, and it's a sort of hire and fire. If you're no longer useful to us, we junk you. That tends to create insecurities in people. Are you despairing of the way contemporary management may be headed?
I think my concern is not so much with the kind of enterprises and issues and challenges that we are facing, but we as our culture, you know, I talked earlier about, in a sense, creating more space within by reducing some of the social pressures towards conformity and so on. But there is also a beautiful side to our culture, which is the empathy and concern for others, the softer side, the spiritual side. Now, that is not something we should junk. That is something that is very vitally important for us. So we have to think of this as a problem in social design, where we are able to move towards more freedom of operation, more autonomy for ourselves, more creative ways of operating, not being hidebound by traditions and straitjacketed into certain kinds of actions. But at the same time, drawing upon the great strengths of this culture. And if we do that, then the kind of dehumanization, the alienation that has come in certain parts of the West, we may be able to escape. You're not going to completely escape, because the system does. I mean, it's a mercenary kind of system, and therefore you're going to have a little bit of that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we completely. Please remember that all Western societies, including the United States, has offset some of the harshness of capitalism by a welfare state, a caring state. So we are likely to move towards that, towards a more free enterprise system, but hopefully also towards a more caring state. Now that is the big challenge. How do we move towards? And my despair perhaps is that the state itself is not moving fast enough towards that kind of a situation. We have the rhetoric, of course, of the welfare state, but in reality, what are the benefits the state is able to provide to people who are marginalized or sort of not found to be fit enough for employment? I'm not sure that much is happening there, and that is the real danger. Are we a caring state or not? As a people, do we create a government that is caring enough or not?
You know, in most people's experience, the example of poor management tends to be the state and in the organs of administration of the state. What hope do you think there is for management studies, management concepts and training to be able to impact the organ of the state that most of us end up interacting with?
I'm glad you asked this question. I was just in England recently, and I had the opportunity to talk to some of the people who are bringing in a quiet revolution in British government. The British government was never as corrupt as ours, but it was never very competent either. It was muddling through kind of system. What Thatcher and Major have done is really remarkable. I mean, you don't have to be a Thatcherite to admire the revolution in governance that she has been able to bring about. For example, she has created the executive agency concept, where now something like 2/3 of the British civil service, I think the total is about 600,000, 2/3 of that civil service has been organized into what we would in management terms call responsibility centers. These are executive agencies headed by professionals on contract appointment, not career civil servants. I mean, they might be career civil servants who happen to be fit for that particular thing. I'll give you an example. I met one Mr. Fogden, who is the head of the employment agency in Britain with about 50,000 people, and their job is to find about 1.7 million jobs in Britain every year. Right? It's a very, very large task and politically a very sensitive task. Now, this man was appointed the head of the agency. He is a career civil servant, but he was not appointed because he was a career civil servant. It was an open selection and he happened to be the best. Now, the interesting thing is that in the employment agency, there are certain tasks performed by the employment agency which are done internally, and yet they advertise. Outside contractors have the freedom to bid. If they win, then they get the job, the internal team cannot get the job. But the nice thing is that the internal team then has to be taken over by the contractor, outside contractor. So there's no loss of employment. So then there's something called the Citizen Charter, which is fascinating, that the public agency, executive agency, makes a public commitment to the people that we will deliver these services in this time frame and so on. And if you don't deliver, then you can be taken to task, maybe taken to court. Like, for example, they'll say, well, if you write to us, we guarantee that we will respond to you in a week. If you make a phone call to us, we will return the call in 24 hours. Now, these are public commitments that the agency makes, and the head is held accountable for performing on that. The Egyptians have developed, that is a very underdeveloped country, nothing. Here is a country which has developed a decision support system for its cabinet. It started as a group of 3, and now there is an army of 600 technocrats that are providing decision support system, developing these for the Egyptian president, for the prime minister, for the various ministers. To give an example, the Minister of Energy wanted to know what would happen to various industries and to various groups of people if I were to raise the tax on electricity by such and such a percent. So they gave this job to these people and they developed their models and so on. And now in pretty much the push of a button, the fellow can see what would happen if he increased tariffs by 10% or 20% or 30% or decrease them. He can see the ramifications industry-wide and in terms of various groups of people. That is the kind of support that is possible. Technically it is feasible. It's a question of whether we are able to convince the government to be able to do it. I suppose that eventually these things will happen. Our problem is, can we speed up the process? You can't have a very dynamic economy with a lot of competition, a lot of pressures of various kinds, and a very inefficient, slow government. Take your court system. You got something like 2.5 million cases in all the courts in India, and the average length may be 5 years. I don't know what it's an incredibly messy situation. You can't have a competitive situation where the resolution of conflicts has to be very quick in the marketplace, and a system that delays resolution of conflict in the judicial system by years and years. These are incompatibilities. So you're going to have to change, and I think it should be possible, and I think that is a new frontier of management. That corporate management is okay, it's going on well, it continue. But the big problem, big frontier of management, in my opinion, is management of government.
As someone who's interested in management structures, where do you think the impetus for this change might come from?
In terms of government?
Yes.
People. Simply the inability of the government to meet. You see what's happening in state after state. You elect a party to power because it promises better governance, and is thrown out of power because it fails to do that. Now, somewhere, some politicians must learn the lesson that the most effective formula for winning elections is not money spending and all that, but to deliver services, which means better management, which means recourse to better ways of allocating resources, better ways of implementing projects, better ways of delivering services. Once that realization enters the mind of our politicians, I suppose the conditions will be right for major advances in management of government.
As someone who's regarded as a guru of management, if I may use that phrase again, have you ever considered going and working in the corporate sector or using those managerial skills to make money?
No. But first of all, I'm not a management guru, I'm a management student. But apart from that, no, I have not thought of it. I'm quite satisfied with what I have, so I have no great ambition of that kind. Primarily my ambitions are of scholarly kind.
when you're not sort of consciously thinking about managing, what do you do? What keeps you busy and what interests you?
Oh, I'm interested in all kinds of things. I'm interested in literature, I'm interested in science, I'm interested in archaeology, which my daughter is doing. I'm interested in music. I'm interested in anthropology.
Well, if you had a free evening tomorrow, how might you spend it?
I don't know whether I would be able to tell you now. I think it's a question of what I find. I might pick up a book and start reading it. I might have an interesting conversation with a friend or with my wife or my daughter. I might meditate. I might write some poem. It's something that I can't predict.
What is it that sort of that drives you, that moves you? What is it that you seek? A sensation, an achievement, a happening that brings fulfillment to you?
I think I've been most happy when I've been creative, when I've developed some new concept or a new theory or a new something, or I've written something creative. That has given me a very great deep satisfaction.
You've written 3 books of poetry. Would you recite a few lines for us to wind up the program?
Okay, I'll recite a very short one. I've been very interested in minimalist poems, trying to write very, very short poems, spare of all unnecessary verbiage, and write very briefly. I'll recite one of these. The poem is titled Seeker. One life I spent entering gates that led nowhere save to the next.
Thank you very much.